Okay, this is chapter 12, part 3. We left off, if you'll recall, we were talking about, we went through the limited effects theories, and then we started off talking about powerful effects, and we went through some of the limited effects, and then we stopped here at moderate effects. And what we want to look at are some of the theories that address media violence, and a lot of these studies that were done, 50 or 60 years ago, were concerned in particular with television and to a lesser extent movies, because after World War II, what happens is mothers in the United States, for the first time in U.S. history, started to go to work in large numbers, right? And a lot of kids at that time in U.S. history were being socialized, by some, in schools or in daycare, but a lot of times by television, right? Television became a social force in the 1950s and in the 1960s. By the time, the late 50s, early 60s came around, the overwhelming majority of Americans had a TV set, and it became kind of a cultural norm and a social force. So naturally, there came studies about what television was doing to people, and also at this time, a lot of people were becoming very skeptical about this whole limited effects model. They're like, you know what? I see the studies, but there's got to be something more to it. In part, remember, as I talked about last time, in part because sometimes the way these studies were done um, didn't really do justice to this issue. They were too simplistic, and they kind of haphazardly drew the conclusion that media don't have a very big effect on people, when in fact there is just a lot more to it. So, anyways, different ideas develop. Let's look at catharsis, social learning theory, and priming effects. So, catharsis is actually one of the theories. It's very different. Catharsis actually says that media violence reduces real life violence. That when you watch the media, then when you watch violence in the media or play it on a video game or whatever, it actually satisfies your hunger, right, for aggression, and reduces your aggression. It purges you of the violent tendencies within you, right? And so it's cathartic. Watching the violence on television or in the movies or playing it in a video game, it's very cathartic, and now we're not going to be violent in real life. A lot of people who like to, you know, watch Quentin Tarantino movies and play, Halo 3 or 4 or whatever they're on now, they love this theory, right? Because like, yeah, see, and I'm not a violent guy, and this is great, but the reality is, and no one's suggesting that playing violent video games is gonna make somebody go out and kill someone. It's not. It's obviously not that simple, and we already know that not everyone is affected in exactly the same way. Okay, hopefully that's clear. But this theory is fairly preposterous, and there's really no evidence for it. I mean, from a scientific standpoint, when they've done the studies. So, but I think it's important to at least grapple with it. You'll see it in some of the textbooks, and so it's important to understand what is meant by this whole idea of catharsis. But it's really a discredited notion. Okay. Now this theory carries a lot more weight. This is one of the more prominent theories, even to this day, in our field. It's called social learning theory. It's developed by Albert Bandura. He was actually a psychologist from the University of Iowa. Um, University of Iowa. Whenever I'm in class and I mention the University of Iowa or the University of Minnesota, I ask my students to give a woot woot for said universities, because I'm a graduate of both of those schools. So please give a woot woot for the University of Iowa. Anyways, So Bandura, how can I explain this? What is he doing? He's very interested, and this is in the 1960s. He's very interested to know whether or not people. He wants to know what will happen when people watch other people carry out violence. Okay, like what's going to happen cognitively and behaviorally. You understand? So what he does is actually really interesting. And by the way, if you want to learn more about this, you can just YouTube Bandura Bobo doll, because what he's doing are these experiments that he calls the Bobo doll experiments. I apologize for the phone in the background. Um, so let me, before I tell you what the theory says, and I know that's really annoying. Before I know it's defined right there, but before I tell you, let me explain what he was doing. So what Bandura did is he actually started off, he was doing work on children, right? So what he would do is he would gather a child or some children, usually one child at a time, and he would have them sit down in this little room, and he would say, just watch, just observe what's about to happen. And he would there would be like a glass, sort of like a glass casing or whatever. So the kid is sitting in a room, but then there's like this glass that you can see. It's like a window basically where you can see into this next room over, right? And inside the other room, and this is the important part, there would be a woman. I don't know why it was a woman. I mean, it could be anybody, but in the experiments that I've seen, it was a woman. Um, and she was there with a big Bobo doll. Okay, that's why it's called the Bobo doll experiment. So, and you guys know what a Bobo doll is? A Bobo doll is a big inflatable doll. It's one of, you know, those dolls where it's like this tall thing. It's just it's inflated, and then if you like smack it or whatever, it falls to the ground, and then it comes right back up. Okay, so it's like the Bobo doll is a very interesting choice because the only purpose for the existence of the Bobo doll is to get beat down. That's like the only purpose of the Bobo doll's existence. Like you slap it and it comes right back up so you can slap it again, right? So anyways, this woman would be in the room and she would be there with the Bobo doll and the kid is on the other side watching, right? And the woman starts to beat up the Bobo doll. She's like, right cross, left hook. I mean, she's just beating on the Bobo doll. She'll even go over and grab a hammer. There's like toys in the room. There's other toys. And she'll go grab a hammer and she'll start beating the Bobo doll, right? And then she kicks the Bobo doll. She body slams the Bobo doll. She's doing all kinds of stuff to the Bobo doll. It's really, it's a violent scene. But she's like, she's playing or whatever, and so Bandura wanted to see what would happen. So what he did is so the woman would he would instruct the kids. He's like, go into the room and play, and Bandura would just sit back and watch basically what the kids would do. These are little kids. They're like 5, 6, 7 years old, and he wanted to see what they would do. And sure enough, the kids would beat the Bobo doll. And they would beat the Bobo, and this is what's interesting, they would beat the Bobo doll in exactly the same way that the woman was beating the Bobo doll. Okay? So if the woman gave an elbow smash to the Bobo doll, that's my wrestling terminology for the day, elbow smash. I haven't seen wrestling in like 20 years, but I still remember the elbow smash. But if she did that, then the kids would, amazingly, they would go in there one by one, on their own. They would give the Bobo doll an elbow smash. If she kicked it, they would kick it in the exact same way. If she body slammed it, they would body slam the Bobo doll. And what's more interesting, in my opinion, is that so Bandura was really smart about this. So he put other toys in there. He put a toy gun. He put a toy gun in the room. But the woman never played with or did anything with the toy gun. She just beat the Bobo doll. And she would take a hammer sometimes and hit the Bobo doll with the hammer. That's it. She didn't do anything with the toy gun. Some of the kids, they would beat the Bobo doll, again, in exactly the same way as the woman, but then they would go grab the gun, you understand? And they would start shooting, play shooting the Bobo doll. And some of the kids even started like hitting the Bobo doll with the gun. They're like pistol whipping the Bobo doll. Okay? So Bandura's sitting there watching all this, and he does many of these experiments. I mean, it's not like he does it twice and it's like, okay, well, I have some conclusions. He does this. I mean, it's a scientific method. He's got random sample. He's got groups. He's doing the experimental design. Random assignment and the whole bit. And what he concludes is that people are learning. These kids are learning. And this is what he gave the name. He called it social learning theory. And now it's better. I can define it for you, and it makes sense. People acquire symbolic representations of behaviors from other people, and these pictures, right, of these symbolic representations provide information on which to base subsequent behavior. In other words, people see people behave in certain ways, and then they model the behavior. They don't necessarily imitate it perfectly. They might, but they model it. So that's actually even more powerful, because what they do is they take the symbolic representation and then they sort of apply it differently in their own situation, in their own experience, in their own life, right? So in other words, we learn how to behave in certain situations. We learn what's good, what's bad, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable by seeing others. And then we ultimately act upon what we've learned, and we apply it in sometimes very sophisticated ways. And this is very relevant to the media. He didn't always, in the other experiments, it's not always that there would be a window and you'd be watching the woman. It would be like a TV, and you see it on the TV, and then you go into the room, and then right. So this is very, even though Bandura is a psychologist doing these studies, right, and a sociologist, media scholars are watching this going, wow, this is really interesting. And it's become one of the major theories in our field. And this is actually a link to, you can watch, there are many links on YouTube, and if you actually click on this, or if you copy and paste this or whatever, or type it into your YouTube or to your browser or whatever, you'll get in the little scroll bar on the right, you'll get a bunch more of these. So you can watch at your leisure. It's actually very interesting, and it's arguably very, very powerful. It's a very powerful statement about media effects, because this is very empirical. This is a very creative way to study it. It's, again, we've already determined it's hard to it's not easy to study the effects of media violence. You can't just sit down and give people a survey and be like, hey, so you watch some violent movies. Do you feel more violent? People don't know, right? I mean, that's deeply problematic. It's also problematic, the whole idea of the one shot before and after experiment, what we call the pre-test, post-test. It's really hard, because what scholars will do, and this is what a lot of the limited effects scholars were doing, they would put people in a room, right, the subjects, and they would give them a questionnaire, and they would answer some questions about violence or whatever, human behavior, attitudes, and then they would watch something violent, like a violent movie, for like an hour and a half. And then they would answer the questions again. And it's like, it doesn't happen that way necessarily. It's like it happens over prolonged exposure. And the problem with doing the questionnaire, with any questionnaire, is there's a sensitization or a desensitization. So people kind of figure out what you're testing. They're like, oh, I see what he's doing here. He wants to know if I've become more violent. And it just, there can sometimes be a spurious effect. But this is very subtle, because it's with children. This is a very sneaky experimental design. It's with children. They don't know what's going on, right? And they're just asked to go play. Hey, go play. And you can see what happens. So it's arguably very powerful. And some of the ideas that came out of social learning theory, what Bandura was arguing, he said that identification is a key part of this. How much does the person resemble you? If they resemble if they're closer to you in terms of age and appearance and things like that, then the learning and the modeling will be more intense. Imitation, you get imitation in some cases where there's direct repetition of an observed behavior, but more commonly you get abstract modeling, which is not the same as imitation. It's what I was describing a couple of minutes ago. It's like you see somebody do something and then you store it, you develop some knowledge, and then you apply it in your own way in the future. So again, and this theory, by the way, has two names in the literature: social learning theory and social cognitive theory. Be careful, because some students get confused and they think that those are two different theories. That's the same theory: social learning theory and social cognitive theory. So just make a little note of that, okay? Three ways that social learning theory works through the media. Observational learning. You learn an unfamiliar behavior by watching it on TV or in a movie. Inhibitory effects and disinhibitory effects, and these are important. If you see some of the research in social learning theory, and there have been hundreds of studies now done on this since the 1960s, but if the behavior is punished, right, in the media, then people are going to be less likely to want to imitate it. If there's a disinhibitory effect, however, that means if the reward is if the behavior is rewarded, right, then the negative behavior becomes more desirable, and it becomes more likely that people will tend to imitate or model, right? And you see this, and this is where people have an issue with, from an ethical standpoint, a lot of the violence in the media. We've talked about this, right? We went through those ethical guidelines, but you know, in many cases, in a lot of the movies, the criminals or the bad guys or whatever are actually kind of heroes. They're heroic. You're watching the movie and you're cheering, you're rooting for them to evade the cops or whatever. So that's where people raise these kind of ethical red flags. So that's social learning theory or social cognitive theory. There are some other studies that are relevant to this discussion of the media and violence. So this guy named Eron, a researcher, he did a longitudinal study. A longitudinal study is a study that's done over time, and it was a field study, meaning it's not done in the laboratory. It's like done in real life. And what Eron and his colleagues, they studied young boys. They visited these young boys in 1962 when they were 8 years old. And then they visited the boys again when they were 19, and then they visited them again when they were men 30 years old. Okay? And it's really interesting. What they found is that the kids who watched lots of violent television when they were 8 years old acted more aggressively as kids, as young adults, and then as men. They had more aggressive lives. They got into more fights. They got into trouble with the law. They were less likely to graduate and get educated. Now, this study is not perfect because it doesn't show causation. You can discredit the study, the Eron and colleagues study. By the way, when you see et al. Like that, Eron, and then it says ETAL, that just means and colleagues. Okay. The problem here is we don't necessarily have causation. We have correlation. There's a correlation between watching the violent TV, and then behaving aggressively in real life, but we don't have a causal relationship here, or we don't know. We can speculate on the cause. We can say it may be because of the TV, but we don't know for sure here, because it may have been something else when the kids were 8 years old that caused them to watch the violent TV in the first place, and which ultimately had more of an effect on their aggression as young adults and as adults, right? Like, for example, maybe they had terrible parents. Maybe their parents were violent. Maybe they got beat, really badly beat as kids. We don't know. I mean, there's other things that may have been going on. These are what we call confounding variables in science, right? Related concepts. Let's look at priming briefly. Priming is the idea that presentations in the media heighten the likelihood that people will develop similar thoughts about those things in the real world. So it's all about associations. The idea is that we have these files in our head. We call them schemas, right? And you have these files that they store information, right? So you have files in your head. Like right now, you have a file on COM 205, for instance. You have a file on whatever, on video conferencing. You have a file on me. You have a file on every one of your friends. You have files on everything, right? That's kind of in your head. You can think of them as like folders. So now you have these folders going. You see a news story about different groups or elements, you file that away. But now you read this news story. Let's say it's about the Israeli military. They kill somebody. Now all of a sudden, it primes certain thoughts about Israel or the Israelis or about the Palestinians or about oppression or about injustice or about violent conflicts or about religion or about whatever. All of a sudden you start to think about these other things. Maybe you think about a trip that you took to the Middle East or something. I mean, the whole idea is that you have these folders, these schemas, and they're linked. Okay? So you see something and it primes you to think about something similar. Okay? And so this is very relevant to the media because the media could prime us to think about all kinds of things. So there's actually an extensive literature now on media priming. Desensitization is another important concept. And there's a lot of really interesting research on desensitization. It refers to a numbing effect, that people will not react to real life violence in the same way as they would have had they not seen the media violence in the first place. So you see some violence in real life, right? And you're just like, you're numb to it because you've already seen it in the media. You understand? So here some studies might make this more clearly. So here's a study. Kids were assigned randomly to two groups. One watched a violent TV show. One of the groups watched a violent TV show, and the other one watched a non-violent TV show. So you have two groups of kids, right? They're randomly assigned. So the kids are the same. We call this the homogenization of the groups, right? We make sure through random assignment that these two groups of kids are exactly the same. And there's, obviously a good number in each group. It's not like one or two kids, right? It's a bunch of kids in each group. One group watches a violent show, another group watches a non-violent show. After watching the show, each child is told to look at a TV screen in a room displaying two kids interacting. They're playing with one another. They're interacting. So after watching the violent show or the non-violent show, every kid individually said, hey, watch this TV screen now. Okay? And they watch the TV screen, and on the TV screen there are these two kids interacting in a nearby room. The researcher tells the kids, hey, sorry, but I have to leave for a couple of minutes. I'll be back shortly. But do me a favor. These are two kids that are interacting in the other room, okay? If there's any trouble, if you notice any trouble, please come and get me, okay? Come and, yell my name or whatever, and I'll come back. I'm not gonna be far away. Then, shortly after the guy leaves, what happens? The kids on the TV, the two kids that are interacting in the other room, that the subject kid is watching on TV, they start to fight. They get into this violent fight. Here's what's interesting. The kids who watched a violent show, remember there were two groups, kids who watched a violent show, kids who watched a non-violent show. The kids who watched the violent show were less likely to come and get the experimenter, the researcher. They didn't see trouble. They're like, they became desensitized. They became numb to the violence. The kids that watched the non-violent show were like, oh my God, these two kids are fighting. And they went out and got the researcher, right? There was a significant difference between these two groups of kids, right? In terms of the effect, the desensitization effect. So let's just kind of summarize what we know about media violence. Whether or not people are affected depends on different contextual variables. We know that there's an effect. I mean, the research is pretty clear. People are affected by and large and on average and on the whole by watching media violence. But the kinds of effects, it kind of depends on these different variables. So first of all, reward and punishment, which we already talked about. If something is rewarded, people will be more likely to model it. Negative consequences for media portrayals of violence will discourage modeling, something else that we know from the research. Motive is important. Viewers will model violence if there's an appropriate motive in the media portrayal, right? If there's an important justification. Realism, more realistic portrayals tend to produce more real-world modeling. That's something else that the research shows. Humor lessens the seriousness of an act and makes it seem as though there aren't serious consequences. So people will be more likely to model violent behavior if it's portrayed in a manner that is humorous. Identification with media characters, as we discussed in the context of social learning theory. More identification leads to more modeling. And then finally, arousal. The more exciting, emotional, and arousing that media portrayals are, the more likely they are to induce violence. This is kind of a nice little 7-point summary of some of the things that we know about media violence and their effects. Let's look at some other theories related to the media and society. This is an important idea by Marshall McLuhan of the Toronto School, called The Medium is the Message. And the whole idea, Marshall McLuhan was what we call a technological determinist. He believed that the specific type of technology that we are using is really important. And actually, in his mind, more important than even the content. That's why he's saying the medium is the message. Like the technology, whether it's the internet or TV or radio or whatever, that is more important than the message. So he's saying the medium is the message, right? He says that the medium itself alters us. It changes us. It changes the way we think, the way we process information, and the way we behave. So he says that human thought and human behavior changed when the newspaper came around. And then human thought and behavior changed again when the radio was invented, and then the TV, and so on and so forth, right? So, and technological determinists today will tell you that the internet fundamentally changed the way people think and the way people behave. So technology itself is what causes the change, not the content per se, okay? And this is the idea of the extensions of man, right? To quote McLuhan, it allows us to see, hear, and touch farther through space and time. Technology does, in that sense. Technology extends our senses, in a sense, right? He predicted, this is very interesting, back in the 1960s, he predicted the creation of a global village brought about by electronic media, which would link people together through the ability to communicate instantaneously across great distances. He's saying this way before the internet was, before the World Wide Web was ever invented, right? I already defined a technological determinism. So a technological determinist, then, is just a person who believes that social, political, economic, and cultural change is inevitably based on the development and diffusion of technology, right? And he was very optimistic. Some people criticize McLuhan because they say, well, you're way too optimistic about all this stuff. and he's not giving any weight to the negative, the harmful effects of technology. Another really important theory. We're just kind of going through, I mean, we've got to go through these, like, we just have to plow through some of these. There's tons of theories in our field, but I want to give you some of the most important ones. And agenda setting is a good, I mean, this is one of the most important theories in our field. There has been more literature on agenda setting than any other theory. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have been done since McCombs and Shaw came up with the idea of agenda setting in 1972. It's actually a really simple idea, and you may have actually heard of it in other contexts. And I may have talked about it in other contexts. I don't even remember, like in this lecture series. But the basic idea is that media don't necessarily tell us what to think. We have other theories that discuss that. They don't necessarily tell us what to think as far as agenda setting is concerned, but they do tell us what to think about. In other words, the media set our agenda. In other words, if the media talk about something, if it's in the news, then people are going to be talking about it. And the research that they do is very simple. Here's what they do. They go out and they study media content. They do content analysis research. They find out what the media are talking about. And then they go do surveys. They ask people, what's on your mind? What do you think is important? What are the most pressing issues? And people, study after study after study, people just repeat what they see in the mass media. Okay? So it's very powerful in a sense. It's also, some people would argue, fairly simplistic, and it doesn't tell us enough about why that happens, and then more importantly, according to some people, about what happens in terms of how we think about these things, these issues, these topics. But there are other theories that address that, and we'll talk about some of those. So that's agenda setting. McCombs and Shaw, two of the most famous names in mass communication research. I once, just as an aside, during my PhD program, I once criticized Max McCombs in front of one of my professors, and she almost bit my head off. Like, she was like, "Don't say anything about Max McCombs." And he's still going strong. He's got to be 80. I don't even know, but he's still at the University of Texas. I'm pretty sure he still teaches. I know he's still publishing because I've read relatively recent, like within the last 2 years, stuff that he's published. So, anyways, the spiral of silence, another really interesting and very important theory. The spiral of silence was developed by a European scholar named Elizabeth Noel Neumann in the late 70s, and she says people who think that their ideas are in the minority will basically stay silent. They won't express themselves in public, right? And in the same way, people that hold the majority view or think that they're in the majority on any issue, on a particular issue, will be eager to speak out. And so what happens is, you can just imagine how this plays out in real life. People that think they're in the majority start to speak. And then it's like it confirms, like for everybody, like, oh wow, these people, this must be the majority. I mean, everybody that's in the majority is speaking. And the people that perceive themselves to be in the minority, initially they're silent, and then they see the majority, and then they become more silent. And so it's a cycle. It's a spiral of silence. Over time, it's like the only thing that's being mentioned is the majority or the perceived majority idea. So it gets more and more dominant over time as more and more people speak out about the issue. And the perceived minority view gets weaker and weaker as fewer people are brave enough to speak about it. And this is what Noel Neumann calls, again, the spiral of silence. So there are some basic assumptions. First of all, one basic assumption is that people want to be popular. They don't want to be shunned, right? They want to be respected. And they're afraid of being isolated from their environment. Nobody wants to be like the only guy in the room of 50 people that has a particular opinion, right? And everybody's looking at you going, oh, what an idiot, right? Nobody wants that. The other assumption, and this is important, is that people are constantly monitoring their environment to find out what the majority viewpoint is, right? Are the people here Republicans or Democrats? You kind of monitor the environment and see, right? So Noel Neumann argues that the news media have a very restricted range of topical interests, which effectively limits the public discourse to start with. Then, because of the spiral of silence effect, many views are then excluded. So we're seeing now, guys, that limited effects model that we talked about, and which many scholars today continue to hold in very high regard, we're seeing that it's been thrown on its head a little bit, at least insofar as some of these theories are concerned, like social cognitive theory, social learning theory, and the spiral of silence, right? Cultivation theory is another. I think I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to divide this up into, I'll have a fourth part. I hope I'll be able to finish in part 4. I'll definitely try to finish in part 4. If I can just get this. Here we go. Part 4. Stay tuned.